Hello, Martin speaking.
Hi Martin, it's Michael from Donate Life. How you going?
Good, thanks.
That's good. Martin, I've got a renal offer for you. It's for a left kidney. The donor is at Royal Melbourne Hospital, and it's a 24-year-old male. I'll tell you a little bit about this gentleman. So he is day 3 in hospital today. He was found by his partner in the bathroom, unresponsive. So the cause of death for this gentleman is a hypoxic brain injury, secondary to polypharmacy overdose. In terms of past history, the patient has previous IV drug use. From a risk aspect, this gentleman is an increased high-risk donor.
Hi, my name's Martin Dutch and I'm a PhD student at the University of Melbourne. Along with my supervisors, Jonathon Knott and Greg Wadley, we are pleased to present our paper, Clinical Decision Support for Increased Risk Organ Transplants, Participatory Design, at this year's OzCHI conference. What you were just listening to is an example of the sort of telephone conversations that occur between donation and transplant professionals when a patient has just died and is suitable for organ transplantation. Before we continue this scenario, I should tell you a little bit more about organ donation and transplantation. Right now in Australia, there are over 1,600 individuals awaiting a life-saving organ transplant. Sadly, for a number of people, an organ offer never occurs, and these patients either die while still awaiting an organ transplant or become too ill to survive transplant surgery. Despite high levels of community support for organ donation, not everyone can become an organ donor. Less than 2% of people who die in hospital die in a way that can facilitate donation. Increasingly, we are considering organ offers from donors at the extremes of age or those at increased risk of transmitting diseases from the donor to the recipients. This paper specifically looks at issues surrounding increased viral risk donors. During organ transplant surgery, certain blood-borne viruses can be transmitted from the donor to the recipient. These viruses include hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and HIV. To avoid unexpected transmission events, we routinely screen all organ donors prior to surgery. These tests are highly sensitive to diagnose established infection. Recently acquired infection, however, cannot always be detected. After infection, the amount of these viruses increase exponentially within the blood. Detection can only occur when the viral count reaches a certain threshold. The amount of time it takes from the infection event until the time for which the virus can be reliably detected is called the window period. Each virus has a unique window period, measured in days, or in the case of hepatitis B, weeks. Importantly, an undetected window period infection within the donor can still be transmitted to the recipient. To determine the risk of a recently acquired infection, we ask family members of the donor about behaviours they've engaged in the preceding window periods. These behaviours include injecting drug use, men who have sex with men, being imprisoned, being a sex worker, being a person who's had sex with any of these higher risk individuals, having a recent diagnosis of a sexually transmitted infection, or being a child born to a high-risk mother. If the potential organ donor has engaged in any of these increased risk behaviours, we designate them as an increased viral risk donor. The organ donation and transplant teams, as well as the potential transplant recipient, then need to decide whether the risks of transmission are outweighed by the benefits of a transplant. There are a number of factors that make this decision-making more complex. The first thing to point out is that this decision is not being made just by one person at one point in time. This diagram shows the organ offer process. The decision to progress an organ offer goes through a number of decision gates. First, the treating team needs to decide if organ donation is appropriate. Second, the organ donation coordinator, and organ donation medical specialists need to agree that donation is reasonable. At that point, the organ offer is placed to the transplant sector. Here, the transplant coordinator, transplant physician, and transplant surgeon all need to believe that the risk of transmission is acceptable. Finally, the patient needs to consider if the risk is acceptable to them. As these decision gates are arranged serially, the most conservative actor can abort the process. Research shows that these decisions not to proceed mainly sit with transplant teams and donation teams. The decision about whether to proceed sits within a complex system. For each individual donor, there may be up to 8 recipient teams. These teams can be in another hospital or in another state. Decisions are often made outside of normal business hours, and there are the complexities of dealing with 3 separate viruses and the subtleties of individual donor risk factors. Objective estimation of risk is possible but requires multiple pieces of information and calculation. There are a number of reasons why one might accept an organ offer from an increased viral risk donor. First of all, the risk of unexpected transmission is objectively low, at less than 1 in 1,000. IVRD organ donors tend to be younger than average and tend to have organs that perform better when transplanted than the average organ, and that can result in reduced mortality for the transplant recipient. The evidence shows us that IVRD designation is associated with an underutilisation of organs, both overseas and in Australia. This means that less Australians are getting access to life-saving organ transplants. Our aim was to produce a risk calculator app, and in doing so reduce the cognitive burden of objective risk estimation. Importantly, we wanted our app to be useful, usable, and used. We adopted a participatory design methodology to develop our risk calculator application. We formed a small project team consisting of a clinical subject matter expert, a software developer, and a human-computer interaction expert. And then we engaged with the key stakeholder groups, including donation nurses and coordinators, donation doctors, transplant physicians, and transplant surgeons. It's noteworthy in this study that we did not include patients. Unlike the development of patient decision support tools, our primary focus was developing a clinical decision support tool and creating a boundary object that would provide utility to both the organ donation and transplant sectors. Therefore, our engagement methods focused on the decision makers involved in the middle 2 gates. We undertook 5 separate participatory design activities to engage with our potential users. We conducted a national online survey of the donation and transplantation sectors to determine feasibility and design requirements, where we had over 120 respondents. We conducted a design workshop held with the Victorian donation sector, where 29 participants attended. We conducted over 6 hours of semi-structured interviews with a range of transplant surgeons and physicians. We conducted a survey of the Victorian transplant sector to identify sector-perceived transplant risks. Finally, we conducted usability studies within the hospital environment, where future users solved a series of clinical tasks using the tool. All activities were approved by University of Melbourne Ethics Review Boards. Our national survey revealed broad-based support for the project. It highlighted that users in different sectors had different design requirements, and differing use cases required the app to be available on both mobile and desktop platforms. One surprising finding was the degree of market penetrance of iPhone, with over 93% of respondents using one for work. Buoyed by these results, we secured philanthropic funding and commenced a design workshop with the donation sector. Design requirements highlighted the importance of ergonomics, with requests for no passwords or logins, minimal text entry, an ability to generate risk reports, and the easy sharing of outputs from the app through existing platforms. Respondents asked that risks be reported not only numerically but visually and be contextualised with other important medical risks and contextualised with the risk of other life events. One interesting design need was the ability to game out different actions the user could take, such as delaying the sampling of blood to see how this would impact the risk of transmission. Based on the requirement to contextualise the risk, we surveyed transplant sectors to identify risks they perceived were significant during the peri-transplant period. Commonly reported risks included post-transplant mortality at 1 and 5 year marks, risk of rejection, risk of death on the wait list, and risks specific to the individual organ being transplanted. The image shows integration of these risks into our prototype. The semi-structured interview provided us with a rich narrative into the challenges of working in the transplant sector. Respondents confirmed that viral transmission risk does modulate the decision to offer organs, and that this risk tolerance varies amongst clinicians. They described the challenges of making these decisions in the wee hours of the morning, often with incomplete data, and highlighted how a single high-profile adverse event could heavily impact future risk tolerance. They described that potential transplant recipients interact with a variety of clinicians within the sector, and it's important that there is a shared understanding of the risks involved, both between the patient and each of the clinicians. They provided detailed feedback about the risk report requirements, including the need for a one-pager summary front sheet, but also highlighted the need for significant detail, including methods, limitations, and confidence intervals. Interestingly, they also requested a patient-facing summary information sheet be provided to facilitate their conversation with patients. Trust was a really important theme in our study. In fact, the decision gates that we've previously highlighted can be thought of as a series of trust transactions. The transplant recipient needs to trust that the risk represented by their treating team is accurate. The transplant team needs to trust the donation sector that they were able to elicit the risk factors accurately. The donation team needs to trust that the families of the deceased have been honest and frank about their behaviours. Finally, the estimated risk associated with any behaviours needs to be trusted. The way the system is designed means independent verification of the risk is difficult or impossible. There's no way that a potential recipient can independently derive an assessment of risk, and a transplant physician or surgeon has no direct interaction with the families of the deceased. There has been important work previously published on the antecedents of trust in IT artefacts. Viewed through this prism of trust, many of the superficially counterlogical design requirements make sense, as they bolster trust in the estimate. One classic example was the repeated need for a high level of detail in the report, while acknowledging that most people would not read it. Paralleling the user-centered design movement, the patient-centered care movement is sweeping through medicine. A key aspect of patient-centered care is shared decision-making. Here, patients are provided with information they need to make informed decisions about their care. The literature abounds with patient decision support tools that aim to facilitate shared decision-making. However, more often than not, these often fail in real-world implementation, mainly due to a lack of clinician endorsement. In this paper, we describe a situation where patients do not have the opportunity to consider the merits of an IVRD organ offer in a shared decision-making model, because clinicians intuit the risk to be unacceptably high to proceed with donation. And while our app and report have some features which would facilitate a shared decision-making conversation with patients, respondents in our paper reinforced the essential role of clinicians and identified the primary purpose of any app should remain informing clinicians. It would seem that regardless of whether one is designing a patient or clinician-facing decision support tool, the clinician support is essential. There were some limitations to our study. The majority of activities were only undertaken in Victoria, and it's possible design needs may differ interstate. Paediatric and cardiac transplant specialties, despite our attempts, were underrepresented. And participation was, of course, voluntary, so disengaged individuals may not have chosen to participate. Shortly, we will commence a trial of the application within the organ donation and transplant sectors. Here we hope to gain further insights into the use of the application and its impact on the acceptance of increased viral risk donor organ offers. The app will be available on an iOS platform as well as the World Wide Web. This QR code links to a short promotional video. So in summary, in our paper, we have developed a detailed PD protocol tailored to the organ and transplant sectors. We've detailed our findings about the problems faced by multiple actors within these sectors. We've described the development and initial testing of a design for a decision support tool. And we've contextualised the project within the related published research.